The world changed on February 28, 2026, and most Americans are just now starting to feel it in their gas tanks, their grocery bills, and in the silence of an alliance that used to stand shoulder to shoulder with us. What you are watching right now, what is unfolding in real time, is not just another Middle East flare-up that the news cycle will forget by next week. This is something categorically different. This is the moment where the architecture of American power, the structure that has been holding the post-World War II world together for 80 years, is being stress tested in ways it has never been tested before. And the cracks are showing, not at the edges, right down the middle. Operation Epic Fury, that is what the United States named its joint military operation with Israel against Iran, began on February 28th, opening with strikes that took out the heart of the Iranian regime, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself, and triggered a torrent of hundreds of retaliatory missiles and thousands of drones from Iran across the entire Middle East. Think about what that means for a moment. The United States went to war, a real war with stealth aircraft, precision munitions, and carrier battle groups against a country of 90 million people without a clear exit strategy, without a coalition of willing allies, and without a plan for what comes the morning after. And now the rift between the United States and Europe over this Iran war has exposed deep structural cracks in NATO that are no longer episodic. They are institutional. That is the story. That is what nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. But we are going to say it right here, right now, because you deserve the truth. The United States-Israel war against Iran, initiated in February 2026, represents one of the most consequential and strategically flawed military undertakings in recent American foreign policy history. And I want you to sit with that for a second. Strategically flawed. Those are not my words alone. Those are the words coming from serious analysts, from war colleges, from institutions that have spent decades studying how great powers rise and fall. And what they are telling us, what the evidence is screaming at us from every direction, is that this war was launched without clearly articulated end state objectives and was built on dangerously optimistic assumptions about Iranian fragility. Here is the brutal reality that nobody in the administration wanted to confront before they dropped those first bombs. Official justifications have shifted between degrading nuclear capacity, achieving regime change, restoring deterrence, and reasserting U.S. primacy in the region. And these are not merely different framings of the same goal. They are structurally incompatible objectives that require different strategies, different instruments, and different definitions of success. You cannot pursue all of those things at the same time with the same military campaign. History tells us that. Vietnam told us that. Iraq told us that. Afghanistan told us that. And yet here we are again. The confrontation took place after years of rising tension over Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missiles, and its military reach across the Middle East. Attempts to renegotiate a nuclear deal in 2025 and 2026 were unsuccessful, and given Iran's weakened position, the United States and Israel calculated that they had greater opportunity to advance their objectives through military means than by diplomatic means. And that calculation, that cold, clinical assessment that the window was open and that Iran was too weak to respond effectively, that calculation is already proving to be one of the most costly strategic miscalculations that Washington has made in this century, because Iran did respond, and it responded in ways that have shaken the entire global economic order. The 2026 U.S.-Israel war on Iran has evolved into a multi-front missile crisis, with the war zone expanding exponentially and touching NATO territory, the Caucasus, the Levant, and the Oman-Persian Gulf simultaneously, threatening to reach the Eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, risking global security. That is the world we are living in right now. Now, let's talk about something that every American needs to understand, because this hits you directly in your wallet, in your daily life. The head of the International Energy Agency described the situation caused by this war as the greatest global energy security challenge in history, not a challenge, the greatest in all of history. Crude oil supply shortfalls are estimated at around 12 million barrels per day as the Strait of Hormuz remains strangled, resulting in a global supply shortage nearing 400 million barrels. Global natural gas supply has been massively undercut, with Qatari liquefied natural gas offline and LNG prices swelling as high as 143% in Asia. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, the United States produces its own oil, we should be insulated. And yes, there is some truth to that, but the global oil market does not work like a local farmer's market where your town's apples don't cost more just because apples got scarce in California. It is one integrated global market. And when 20% of the world's oil supply gets choked off at the Strait of Hormuz, every barrel on earth gets more expensive. The national average in the US is over $4 a gallon, and countries more reliant on Iranian supply have seen price surges of more than 50%. That is a tax on every American family, every single one. But the energy shock is just the visible surface of something much deeper and much more consequential. What is happening beneath the surface is a fundamental restructuring of global economic and geopolitical power. And this is the part that should concern every American citizen who cares about this country's future. Investors, economists, and strategists around the world share a common conclusion: not fear of a specific catastrophe, but something more unsettling. The sense that a series of permanent structural shifts in supply chains, geopolitical alliances, and the balance of economic power have been accelerated by a war that nobody in power fully planned for. Permanent structural shifts, let that land. This is not something that goes back to normal when a ceasefire gets signed. The world that comes out of this war is going to look fundamentally different from the world that went into it. And the people who are benefiting from America's strategic stumble, that ought to infuriate every single one of you. Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz, where some 20% of the world's oil passes, was as predictable as it was destructive for U.S. interests. But for Russia, this meant higher oil prices that boosted its war economy. It also led to the temporary but ongoing easing of U.S. sanctions, which has provided Moscow an indispensable lifeline after years of economic pressure over the war in Ukraine. Think about what that means. America spent years building a sanctions architecture against Russia, trying to squeeze Putin's war machine, trying to cut off the revenue streams that fund Russian tanks and missiles in Ukraine. And now, because of this war in Iran, because of the chaos in the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices have spiked and the pressure on Russia has been relieved. America effectively handed Vladimir Putin a lifeline. A professor at Johns Hopkins summed it up in three brutal statements that I want you to remember: good for Russia, good for China, bad for America. Now let us talk about China, because this is where the long-term strategic damage may be most severe. It was China that pressed Iran to accept the 14-day ceasefire proposal brokered by Pakistan. China has slowly chipped away at America's longtime status as global mediator of first resort. Beijing has successfully mediated in the past between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it attempted to do the same with Russia and Ukraine and Israel and the Palestinians. In general, the Iran war adds weight to Beijing's worldview that the US-led liberal international order is over. Do you understand the magnitude of that? The United States, for 80 years, has been the country that other countries call when they want a deal brokered, when there is a crisis, when there are negotiations, when someone needs to sit at the table and hold things together. The world has called Washington. And now Beijing is stepping into that role, not by defeating America militarily, not by outbuilding America's Navy or matching its Air Force, but simply by being the steady, predictable, rational actor in the room while Washington lurches from deadline to threat to temporary ceasefire and back again. Iran and China have seized this war as an opportunity to address a shared gripe about the global financial system, ending the hegemony of the US dollar. For years, Washington has leveraged the dominance of the dollar in international trade to exert influence and inflict pain on enemies and competitors. And now the Strait of Hormuz crisis is giving them the perfect opening to accelerate the push toward yuan-denominated oil transactions. The supremacy of the dollar is especially apparent in the global oil market, where about 80% of transactions are settled in the currency, according to estimates by JP Morgan Chase. That dominance, that petrodollar architecture, is exactly what makes American sanctions powerful. It is what gives the American Treasury the ability to cut countries off from the global financial system. And it is exactly what China and Iran are working together right now to dismantle. This war did not start that process, but it dramatically accelerated it. And then there is NATO. And this is the story that I think cuts deepest for me personally, because I have spent my career thinking about what American power means and what alliances are supposed to be for. European countries restricting U.S. access to military bases during the Iran war have exposed a deepening rift within NATO and fueled fears that Donald Trump could use it as a pretext to scale back Washington's commitment to Europe's defense. Let us walk through exactly what happened, because the details matter. Spain, the most vocal European opponent of the war, said that the country's airspace is closed to U.S. military planes involved in the conflict. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has described the war as unjustifiable and dangerous. Italy's government denied U.S. bombers the use of a military base in Sicily. The United Kingdom's Prime Minister initially blocked the use of British bases, citing a desire to avoid the mistakes of Iraq. France approved U.S. requests on a case-by-case basis, but has been accused of blocking specific operations. Trump called Spain a terrible ally and threatened to end all trade with the country. Now, here's where this gets constitutionally and institutionally significant in a way that nobody is talking about clearly enough. An internal Pentagon email has outlined options for the United States to punish NATO allies it believes failed to support U.S. operations in the Iran war, including suspending Spain from the alliance and reviewing the U.S. position on Britain's claim to the Falkland Islands. Spain, a founding pillar of the Western alliance system, a democracy, a country that has contributed troops to NATO missions for decades, is now being threatened with suspension from the very alliance that is supposed to represent the collective defense of the free world. And here is the jaw-dropping irony. NATO's founding treaty does not include any mechanism to suspend or remove one of its members. The tool being threatened does not legally exist, which tells you that what is actually happening here is not about legal process. It is about coercion. It is about Washington saying, you either do what we tell you or we will find ways to make you pay. The disagreement is not procedural. It is conceptual. European governments view the Iran campaign as a discretionary war, not a collective defense necessity. NATO's Article 5 applies to attacks on member states, not to offensive operations. By blurring that distinction, Washington risks hollowing out the legal and political foundations of the alliance. And this is the core of it. This is the thing that Poland is losing sleep over, that the Baltic states are nervous about, that Germany and France are quietly debating in rooms we do not have access to. Because if the United States can demand that NATO allies participate in offensive wars of American choosing and threaten to withhold Article 5 protections if they refuse, then the entire premise of the alliance, collective defense, sovereignty, unanimous consent, becomes meaningless. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk has publicly questioned whether the United States would honor its Article 5 commitments. This is not rhetorical dissent. It reflects anxieties in Eastern Europe where deterrence credibility is existential. And that anxiety matters enormously because while America is stretched across the Middle East, while 3 carrier battle groups are sitting in the Persian Gulf, while the defense industrial base is scrambling to quadruple weapons production to keep up with the consumption rate of this war, the diversion of critical weapons systems from Estonia to support operations in Iran has left frontline states exposed. The countries on NATO's eastern flank, the countries that are literally on Russia's border, are looking at their depleted defenses and looking at the United States that is locked in a Middle East war without a clear end game, and they are doing the math, and the math is frightening. The risk of great power war persists, and contingencies such as a crisis in the Taiwan Strait and Russia-NATO clashes are given an even chance of occurring in 2026 and are rated as high impact due to their potential to draw the United States into a direct military conflict with China or Russia, an even chance, 50-50, of a war that would make the Iran conflict look like a skirmish. World military expenditure reached $2,987 billion in 2025, an increase of 2.9% in real terms, the 11th consecutive year of increases, bringing the global military burden to 2.5% of global GDP, its highest level since 2009. The entire world is arming up. Every major power is spending more on weapons than at any point in a generation. And the United States, the country that is supposed to be the stabilizing anchor of the international system, the country that has underwritten global security since 1945, is now at war in the Middle East in a conflict that its own allies consider illegal, while its adversaries in Moscow and Beijing sit back, watch us exhaust ourselves, and quietly expand their influence in every corner of the world that Washington is no longer paying attention to. The 2026 U.S.-Israeli strikes against Iran represent one of the most consequential military interventions in recent Middle Eastern history, and the structural constraints of such a conflict risk the intervention transforming into a strategic overextension for the U.S. strategic overextension. That is the polite academic term for what happens when a great power stretches its military, economic, and political resources past the breaking point. It is what happened to the British Empire. It is what happened to the Soviet Union. And the question that historians will be asking about this moment, the question that we need to be asking right now, while there is still time to course correct, is whether the United States is at that inflection point, whether the decisions made in Washington in the winter of 2026 will be remembered as the moment that the American century began its final chapter, with the national debt climbing past $38 trillion and then $39 trillion under Trump's year and change back in office. office, interest costs are larger than defense and education spending combined, forcing tough choices. Trump himself told a private audience at the White House that the federal government might soon not be able to afford Medicare and Medicaid because it needed to prioritize military spending. Think about what that means for ordinary Americans. Think about your parents. Think about your grandparents. Think about what they paid into Medicare their entire working lives. And now imagine being told that the bill for a war in the Middle East that your closest allies called unjustifiable might crowd out the health care that you earned. That is not a hypothetical. That is the trajectory that this country is on. This is not a war that can be won in any meaningful strategic sense. In either scenario, military victory or strategic failure, the United States loses. Both plausible outcomes carry consequences profoundly damaging to American interests, credibility, and influence. An Iranian strategic success shatters the petrodollar architecture and accelerates the decline of American hegemony. But even an American military victory, whatever that means in a country of 90 million people with a deeply entrenched government and a history of outlasting foreign pressure, leaves the United States holding a broken Middle East, a fractured NATO, an emboldened China, a relieved Russia, and a domestic economy straining under the weight of war costs that nobody budgeted for. There is no clean exit. There is no victory parade coming. And the sooner the American public understands that, the sooner we can start having an honest national conversation about what comes next. Because what comes next is the real question, not whether America wins or loses in Iran, but whether America can reorganize its foreign policy around a realistic understanding of its actual power and its actual interests before the damage becomes irreversible. The world is not waiting. States across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America are avoiding binary choices, seeking to maximize benefits from both powers. They are watching what is happening in the Persian Gulf, and they are drawing conclusions about American reliability, American judgment, and American staying power. And many of them are hedging, quietly, carefully, strategically, not because they hate America, but because they are doing exactly what any rational actor does when the dominant power in their neighborhood starts behaving unpredictably. They are looking for alternatives. They are building relationships with Beijing. They are exploring what a world without American primacy looks like, and the Iran war, Operation Epic Fury, may well be remembered as the moment that process crossed a point of no return.